Have you ever noticed how some relationships seem to circle back to the same place no matter how much time passes? Even as the years move forward and circumstances evolve, certain conversations retain the same shape. The details may be different, but the experience feels strangely familiar, as though you've stepped into a scene you've lived before. Maybe it's a family member or a friend. Maybe it's someone you care deeply about and genuinely want in your life. You already know which topics create tension. You know which comments will spark frustration. You know how the conversation typically unfolds. And if you're honest, you've probably spent time wishing the other person would simply see things differently. Most of us do. We spend years trying to understand why someone else keeps responding the way they do. We wonder why they continue making the same choices, approaching situations from the same perspective, or repeating the same behaviors. But after enough repetitions, the pattern itself becomes harder to ignore than the frustration. And when that happens, a different question begins to emerge. What if the most important thing to understand isn't the other person? What if it's the dance itself? Today, I want to explore that idea. Welcome back to the Motivated Savages podcast, where we live bold, lead fearless, and ignite our path forward. I'm Jody Savage, and today we're going to talk about the dance we share with others. One of the things I've always loved about dancing is that every dance tells a different story. The same song can play twice, and the same people can find themselves on the same dance floor. The same room can be filled with the same energy. Yet somehow, the experience is never identical, because a dance is shaped by countless small choices unfolding in real time. A dance is really a conversation without words. One movement invites another, and one step creates a response. A subtle shift in rhythm can alter the entire experience. Whether you're leading or following, you're constantly paying attention, adapting, responding, and creating something together. The more I think about it, the more I notice that certain relationships share a similar quality. It's not that people are particularly predictable. Most aren't. But patterns often are. Given enough time, every relationship develops a rhythm. Certain conversations become familiar, and certain reactions become expected. Without realizing it, we begin moving through the relationships the way dancers move through a routine they've practiced so many times, they no longer have to think about the steps. What fascinates me is how quickly these patterns become invisible. We stop noticing the assumptions we've carried into the room or the roles we've unconsciously accepted. We stop noticing the reactions that arrive before we've even had a chance to think about them. Eventually, we become so familiar with the dance that we forget we're dancing at all. One of the most surprising things about being human is how quickly familiar responses become automatic ones. Someone says something that challenges us, and we instinctively defend our position. Someone disappoints us, and we revisit an old frustration. Someone withdraws, and we move closer. Someone disagrees, and we begin building our case. None of these responses are necessarily wrong. In fact, many of them developed for very good reasons. The challenge is that what once served us can eventually become a limitation. The danger of familiarity is that it often disguises itself as wisdom. We assume that because we've always responded a certain way, it must be the right way. Yet some of our oldest patterns survive, not because they're effective, but because they're comfortable. Life continues moving forward, yet the choreography often remains surprisingly unchanged. That's what's caught my attention lately. The conversations that frustrate me most often feel strangely familiar. Not because the circumstances are identical, but because my participation was. I keep bringing the same expectations and assumptions, reactions and approaches into situations that I hoped would somehow produce different outcomes. What became difficult to ignore wasn't the consistency of other people. It was the consistency of me. And that's where the word participation started feeling more useful than the word frustration. For many people, the moment they hear the word participation, they assume blame is standing right behind it. I don't think that's true. Participation is not blame. Recognizing your role in a pattern doesn't mean you're responsible for everything that pattern contains. It doesn't mean both people carry equal accountability. It doesn't mean both people are equally self-aware, equally healthy, or equally willing to grow. What it means is that you've stopped viewing yourself as a spectator and started recognizing yourself as a participant. And participants, unlike spectators, possess the ability to influence what happens next. Recently, I've become suspicious of the idea that every difficult situation can be solved by trying harder. Many of us are incredibly persistent. We explain our position more clearly and repeat ourselves more often. We invest more energy and push harder against the same obstacle because we're convinced the answer is just a little more effort. Yet effort and effectiveness aren't the same thing. Persistence asks you to remain faithful to what matters. Repetition asks us to remain loyal to a method that may no longer serve us. And wisdom is knowing the difference. And nowhere does that distinction matter more than in a relationship we genuinely want to keep. I'm not talking about relationships that have run their course. I'm talking about the ones that matter, the ones worth preserving and worth understanding. The ones where, despite the frustration and misunderstandings, we still hope to find a way forward. Those relationships often require something deeper than agreement. They require discernment. The discernment to recognize when an old approach is no longer creating the connection we're hoping for. The discernment to recognize when we become attached to a method rather than a meaningful outcome. And perhaps most importantly, the discernment to ask a different question. Instead of asking why another person keeps doing what they've always done, we begin wondering why we continue responding the way we always have. That's not a question of fault. It's a question of awareness. And awareness creates options. One of the beautiful things about dancing is that the dance changes the moment one dancer changes their step. A shift in movement alters the rhythm of the interaction. The energy changes and the possibilities expand. The other dancer may continue moving exactly as they always have, but the experience itself is no longer the same. Life works much the same way. The goal isn't to control the other person. The goal isn't to choreograph every interaction. The goal is to become aware enough to choose our next step intentionally rather than automatically. Sometimes that choice changes everything, and sometimes it changes very little. But it always creates a new possibility. And possibility is where growth lives. As I started paying closer attention to this idea, I began seeing it everywhere. In leadership, in friendships, and in parenting. In habits and in goals. Even in the stories I told myself. When I feel stuck, I notice I'm looking outward for the solution. What needed to change? Who needed to change? What obstacle was standing in the way? But now, a more useful question has emerged. How am I participating in this? That question doesn't always provide an easy answer, but it almost always provides a useful one. Because growth begins when awareness replaces autopilot. Now this week, I want you to think about a relationship that genuinely matters to you. Not one you want to leave behind, one you want to preserve, one you want to understand and improve. Then ask yourself, what dance have we been doing? What role do I consistently play within it? What assumptions do I keep bringing into the room? And what might become possible if I choose a different step? Not because you're wrong, not because they're right, but because awareness creates options, and options create change. I've always loved dancing. Not because every dance is perfect, but because every dance is a conversation. A series of movements, responses, adjustments, and choices unfolding, one step at a time. Life works much the same. We don't get to choose every song life plays. We don't get to choreograph every circumstance or direct every person who enters our lives. But we do possess one enduring freedom: the ability to choose our next step. And perhaps that's where wisdom has been waiting all along. Not in learning how to change the people around us, but in learning when to change the way we move among them. Because sometimes the relationship doesn't need a different person. Sometimes it simply needs a different dance. I'm Jody Savage, and this is the Motivated Savages podcast. Live bold, ignite your path. That's the Savage way. If this message resonated, share it with someone who may be dancing a familiar dance and looking for a new step. And if you want to carry this message with you, check out our merch line at motivatedsavages.com. We've designed gear to remind you to live bold every day. Together, we're building the Savage community, a movement of people choosing purpose, growth, and bold living.